Bad news for Las Vegas Raiders fans. Matthew Stafford is officially off the table. This morning, news broke that Stafford has restructured his contract with the Los Angeles Rams, locking him in for the foreseeable future. That means any hopes of him joining the Raiders are now gone. For a while, it looked like the Raiders had a real shot at bringing in Stafford. There was even talk that they might go all in, making a big move to land him and push for a Super Bowl. And honestly, Stafford would have been a great fit. But in the end, it didn't work out. Reports say the Raiders only offered him a 2-year deal, which wasn't enough. On top of that, the Rams wanted the Raiders' 6th overall draft pick, and that was a deal-breaker. Paying Stafford $50 million a year is one thing, but giving up a top draft pick on top of that? The Raiders weren't willing to do it, and honestly, you can't blame them. Now, the focus shifts. The Raiders will explore other veteran quarterback options. According to Adam Schefter, one name to watch is Russell Wilson. Justin Fields and Sam Darnold are reportedly on the Raiders' radar. But of course, this raises a big debate. Should the team go after a veteran quarterback or take a chance on a rookie? Some fans might say, why not draft a young quarterback? But here's the problem. This year's rookie quarterback class isn't strong. Outside of Cam Ward, there's no clear first-round talent. Using the 6th overall pick on an unproven QB would be a massive gamble, one the Raiders can't afford to take. That pick could land them an elite edge rusher, a top-tier wide receiver, or even a game-changing running back, players who could shape the team's future for the next 10 to 15 years. Wasting it on a risky quarterback just doesn't make sense. Next year's draft class looks much better. Names like Garrett Nussmeier and Drew Aller are already generating buzz, and every year a breakout star emerges. So if the Raiders want a franchise QB, waiting might be the smarter move. For now, the best option is to bring in a veteran. Stafford was the ideal choice, but since that's no longer an option, the Raiders have to look elsewhere. Personally, I'm not sold on Russell Wilson or Justin Fields. Between the two, Wilson is the safer bet. He's more consistent and gives you a better shot at winning. Fields, on the other hand, is boom or bust. He has flashes of brilliance, but he's still unproven as a long-term solution. Justin Fields under Chip Kelly? Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But there's also a real risk he turns into another Sam Darnold situation. Then there's Russell Wilson. He might help you in the regular season, but can you trust him to win big playoff games? I'm not convinced. And while Justin Fields has that boom potential, there's just as much chance he busts out completely. Now, Sam Darnold is an interesting case. Unlike Wilson or Fields, signing Darnold would be a long-term commitment. And that's the problem. Do the Raiders really want to lock themselves into that kind of deal? Darnold isn't a bad quarterback. In fact, he had a solid season last year. But at 26 or 27, do you bet on him developing into a top 5 quarterback in the next few years? It's a huge risk. Look at the Atlanta Falcons. They got stuck in quarterback limbo. Or take the Cleveland Browns, who are now tied to Deshaun Watson, paying him $50 million a year with no way out. If the Raiders go all in on Darnold and it doesn't work out, they could be trapped in the same situation. If I were the Raiders, Darnold would be my last resort. Unless you truly believe he can be a consistent playoff quarterback, signing him just doesn't make sense. That's why, if the Raiders want a veteran, I'd much rather see them take a short-term shot with Aaron Rodgers. He's still better than Wilson, Fields, and Darnold right now. Yes, he's declining, but if it doesn't work, you move on and draft a quarterback next year. No long-term mess. Of course, there are already reports that Rodgers is likely heading to the New York Giants. That move makes sense. He was just with the Jets, so switching teams in the same city wouldn't be a big adjustment. There's also the issue of Rodgers' personality. Would he mesh well with Pete Carroll? Hard to say. At the end of the day, though, this is tough for the Raiders. Stafford was the perfect fit, and missing out on him stings. Some have suggested Zach Wilson as a potential quarterback for the Raiders, but I don't see it. At least Sam Darnold has shown flashes of being a capable QB. Wilson hasn't even done that. If there was any real upside to his game, we would have seen glimpses by now. Darnold, for all his inconsistencies, has had moments where he looked like a solid starter. Wilson? Not so much. Sure, Wilson would be a cheap option, maybe in the same category as Baker Mayfield or Darnold. But if the Raiders are going that route, they might as well bring in every backup available. Justin Fields, Joshua Dobbs, anyone. And let them compete for the job. Now, missing out on Matthew Stafford was a tough blow, but the good news is that the Raiders still have time. Free agency is still ahead, and there are still potential options like Fields, Wilson, and Darnold. The season doesn't start for months, so there's no need to panic. And honestly, I think the Raiders are handling this the right way. You don't want to rush into a bad quarterback decision. The fact that they were interested in Matthew Stafford and Ben Johnson is actually a good sign. It shows they're being smart about this. Some fans have been frustrated, saying, "What's the point of talking to these guys if we can't sign them?" But remember, you can't sign someone you don't talk to. These conversations are necessary steps in the process. Look at teams like the Steelers. They didn't just throw money at one guy. They tested different options, from Kenny Pickett to Russell Wilson to Justin Fields. It hasn't worked out yet, but they're giving themselves chances. And history shows that patience can pay off. The Buccaneers landed Tom Brady late in his career and won a Super Bowl. The Broncos did the same with Peyton Manning. For the Raiders, staying patient and making the right decisions is key. Rushing into a long-term deal for someone like Darnold could be a huge mistake. What if next year they're in position to draft a top quarterback? Locking themselves into a bad contract now could prevent them from making the right move later. So while it's frustrating to miss out on guys like Stafford, the Raiders are still in a position to get this right. The key is not to panic, and to keep looking for the right fit. This one was a bit surprising. Reports suggest that the Raiders are shopping Michael Mayer and Zamir White. Now, I don't really care much about White, but Mayer? That's an interesting situation. This report comes from Tashin Reed and Vic Tafur of The Athletic, and they're not the type to just make things up. But still, it's shocking to hear that the Raiders are willing to move on from Mayer. Let's be real. Mayer hasn't exactly been a game changer over the past 2 seasons. Even as a rookie, he wasn't great, and last year, the Raiders essentially replaced him by drafting Brock Bowers. The team initially said they would use both in a 2 tight end set, and they did at times. But when they ran 11 personnel, 1 running back, 1 tight end, Mayer was often on the sideline. It's worth noting that Mayer missed the first half of last season, which may have slowed his development. But the fact that the Raiders are already looking to move on is concerning, especially since they traded up to draft him. I wasn't a huge fan of the pick when it happened. Tight ends, in general, don't often change the game unless you have someone truly special like Brock Bowers, and Mayer wasn't even the first tight end off the board in his draft class. Yet, Dave Ziegler and Josh McDaniels believed he was their guy. Now, just 2 years later, the Raiders are reportedly willing to let him go for a mid-round pick. If a team really needs a tight end, maybe they offer a 3rd-round pick at best. But honestly, Mayer hasn't shown much. He's not an elite route runner, doesn't create much separation, and hasn't been a major playmaker. Sure, he's got size and can win some 50-50 balls, but that's about it. Ideally, the Raiders would keep Mayer. He's still a solid blocker and could contribute if given a full, healthy offseason. If he can stay on the field and avoid last year's personal issues, maybe he can put up 500 to 600 yards and help open things up for Bowers. And let's not forget, you can never predict injuries. If a key receiver goes down, maybe the Raiders shift Bowers outside and keep Mayer at tight end. If Bowers misses time, Mayer could step in as the primary guy. So while the trade rumors are out there, I still think keeping Mayer makes the most sense for the Raiders, at least for now. In the NFL, draft picks are always more valuable than the players they turn into. The Raiders will never get back the 33rd pick they used on Michael Mayer. His value is already diminished. That's why I think the team should just stick with him. Trading him now doesn't make much sense, but if they do move him, they better get at least a 3rd-round pick. Realistically, that's unlikely. Mayer is 2 years into his rookie contract and hasn't exactly impressed. At best, the Raiders might get a mid to late round pick for him. But the bigger picture here is that GM Tom Telesco, like any new GM, won't agree with every roster decision made by the previous regime. Some players will be traded, some will be cut, and others simply won't be re-signed. Take Trayvon Moehrig and Malcolm Kunce, for example. If Telesco had been here last year, he might have traded them early to get something in return. Now, the Raiders may lose them for nothing. The same situation applies to Mayer. The team has to decide whether to cut ties now for a small return or hope he turns into a contributor. As for Zamir White, his trade value is basically non-existent. I doubt any team would even offer a 7th-round pick for him. Running backs already have low value in today's NFL, and White hasn't shown much of anything. He's had every opportunity to prove himself, but he lacks vision, quickness, and change of direction skills. Sure, he has decent straight-line speed, but that's one of the most overrated traits for a running back. If the Raiders are trying to move White, it likely means they're planning to revamp the entire backfield, which they desperately need to do. Last year's group was flat-out terrible. Alexander Mattison is a free agent, and I don't see the Raiders bringing him back. Amir Abdullah could return. But White? He's probably getting cut. Expect Chip Kelly and the Raiders to bring in at least 2, maybe even 3, new running backs. Dylan Lobb will stick around since he's on a rookie contract, but at this point, he's probably just a special teams guy. The good news? This year's draft is loaded with running back talent. There are at least 15 guys who could make an impact, and about 6 or 7 who could start right away as rookies. Some of these players will step in and get 10-plus carries per game from week 1. This draft class is stacked, and if the Raiders play their cards right, they might finally fix their running back problem.